So, Benjamin, the Israel's president described a very special relationship between Israel and Germany. Okay, now Germany for the last couple of years has been on the Human Rights Council. What's Germany done on the Human Rights Council in general, and also for Israel?
Well, with respect to Germany's role on the Human Rights Council and what it's done for Israel, I would say very little. The fact, one could make a strong argument that Germany has vehemently opposed Israel's security interests on the Human Rights Council. There was a recent vote where Germany, as part of the UN body, voted against Israel with respect to a weapons embargo. So you have an issue that's dealing with a core security interest of Israel, and the German federal government rejected Israel's position with respect to self-defense. So it's for the most part, Germany has consistently voted against the Jewish state at most of these UN bodies.
How do you explain that?
Well, Germany tends to hide behind the skirt of the EU and other countries. So in terms of explaining why Germany votes against Israel, as I've said over the years, Germany hides behind the skirt of the EU. That means Germany will vote with other EU countries like France who vote against Israel. But I also think Germany enjoys beating up on Israel at the UN. They've turned Israel into a human punching bag for years. I've reported on the German Foreign Ministry engaging in what critics call flagrant anti-Semitism. Take the example of Christoph Heusgen, a German ambassador to the UN, who served on the Security Council, who equated Israel a few years ago with the anti-Semitic terrorist jihadi organization Hamas. As a result of that equation, that comparison, which really was an equation, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a human rights organization in Los Angeles, classified Heusgen's remarks to be one of the top 10 outbreaks of anti-Semitism in, I believe, about 2 years ago. So the point is, this is not an anomaly, what Heusgen has done. Heusgen has been severely criticized by the foreign ministry in Israel. And I guess the irony of the situation is Israel and Germany were competing for a post on the Security Council a number of years ago, and the Israelis thought Germany would defer to Israel and allow Israel for the first time to be on the Security Council as a non-binding member. And Germany, according to reports from, I think, Benny Avni in the New York Post, Germany double-crossed Israel. And then said, the federal government then said, well, if we're on when we're on the Security Council, we'll protect the security interests of Israel because of this so-called special relationship between Israel and Germany. And the opposite happened. Germany was consistently voting against Israel and even engaging in some of the most wretched forms of delegitimization of Israel.
Now, I'm going to give you a quotation, which I'll ask you to quote in the answer. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said that the German-Israel history is not only a historic responsibility, but also a deep motivation in my political action. He emphasized that he went into politics because of Auschwitz. How do we explain this kind of behavior in that context?
Well, there's a pressing question that's circulating right now is how do you explain Heiko Maas's statement that he went into politics because of Auschwitz. He's the German foreign minister, and he declared prior to becoming foreign minister, or at the outset of his tenure, I went into politics because of Auschwitz. He's actually done everything to contradict that statement because he's waged a diplomatic offensive against Israel at the UN. He's deeply wedded to this incurably flawed nuclear agreement that's being negotiated right now, the JCPOA, the formal name, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in Vienna. And this agreement, which all of Israel is opposed to, allows the Islamic Republic of Iran within 10 years to build a nuclear weapons device. Heiko Maas said last week that this alleged sabotage of the Natanz nuclear facility that was attributed to Israel. We don't know who caused the damage. Right now, the Iranians are searching for an Iranian man who they blame, as of yesterday, for the explosion at this facility. But the bottom line is, Heiko Maas went on the record and said it's not helpful, and shifted the blame to Israel to try to stop Iran from, to put it in my words, from getting a nuclear weapon or sabotaging their nuclear weapons program.
What got into Maas's head? What happened?
Pardon?
What happened to Maas?
In terms of Heiko Maas's sociology and his personality and how he's developed, it's clear that he was never pro-Israel. I mean, this is pure rhetoric, and it shows that the disconnect between this type of politically empty rhetoric about going into Auschwitz and his concrete behavior. Now, how do you explain it? The explanatory model, I would argue, is that Maas is largely fixated on anti-Semitism between 1933 and 1945. That is, he only sees anti-Semitism up until 1945, unless it's some minor group of neo-Nazis in a province in Germany that make some classical anti-Semitic statements. He doesn't understand or recognize contemporary anti-Semitism, namely this stripping Israel of his existence, or anti-Semitism within his party, the Social Democrats, or anti-Semitism from Islamic regimes like the Islamic Republic of Iran. In my view, unfortunately, he's turned out to be severely incompetent and unfit to be a foreign minister, and he's largely betrayed Israel, and his statement about going into politics because of Auschwitz is frankly a sick joke.
Okay. And is there a lot of pressure within Germany to reverse its position at the UN?
Is there pressure on Germany to reverse its position at the UN? Yes, but it's from a small party called the Free Democratic Party that several years ago pushed a motion in the Bundestag. This is an opposition party with it just barely made it into the Bundestag, but still, they're in the Bundestag. And they pushed a resolution to reverse Angela Merkel's anti-Israel positions at the UN. And it's important to remember that even though Heiko Maas is leading the diplomatic war against Israel and the political war against Israel at the United Nations and its various bodies, Chancellor Merkel has green-lighted all these decisions. She's expressed no opposition. In fact, her party and her coalition partners, the Christian Social Union from Bavaria, and of course Heiko Maas's Social Democratic Party, both oppose the resolution in the Bundestag to promote a neutral, or at least possibly a pro-Israel position at the UN, which is simply, when you translate it into common sense discourse, would mean not singling out Israel in an anti-Semitic way. Because Germans have said this, critics of Germany's UN policy have said, putting aside the motivation, whether the motivation is anti-Semitic from Heiko Maas and Chancellor Merkel, and I do think there are anti-Semitic motivations at play here. I can delve into that later from various German diplomats. Putting that question aside, the policy that's currently unfolding is anti-Semitic, according to a number of German experts on anti-Semitism, because of the disparate treatment that is targeting Israel. And anti-Semitism in this case is simply the discrimination against Jews. And Israel, as we know, has been is the country that's most singled out for punishment and discipline at the United Nations.
I want to go on to the issue of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Only a few years ago, the German contribution to UNRWA was minimal, nominal. Now, all of a sudden, it's the leading funder. How did that happen? How did that happen that they become the leading funder, not only funding material for UNRWA, but without any conditions?
How has it become that Germany is now the leading funder of UNRWA without any conditions? Germany is infatuated with the UN. Since the creation of the UN and the Holocaust, Germany thinks this world body is the be-all and end-all of bringing about some type of utopia in the world. So that means Germany still cannot distance itself or criticize the UN in a way where it would perhaps influence a change in the UN's policy toward Israel. Because, again, Germany has this delusional view about the UN. That's served Germany's interests well, but at the same time, Germany lacks the fire in the belly, the political will to combat anti-Semitism at the UN, where it's quite ubiquitous, including within this this so-called humanitarian organization, UNRWA, that provides aid to the Palestinians in disputed territories and different parts of the world, Syria, Jordan, etc. Germany is now spending, I think, over 210 million euros. It's an astronomical amount of money. German taxpayers are largely unaware that their money is being misused to fund Palestinian textbooks that stoke anti-Semitism. I mean, your center recently came out with new evidence the other day that I read in the outlet, the Washington Free Beacon, by a very sharp reporter, Adam Credo, that documented the latest round of anti-Semitism in school books in the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, namely deleting Israel's presence in the Middle East and imposing a full-blown Palestinian state on Israel. That's the imposing a full-blown Palestinian state on the map and extinguishing Israel. And that type of material is in the UNRWA school books as of now, according to your center's research, is the classical definition of contemporary anti-Semitism. And there's a lack of outrage. And the German government, with the exception, there have been some media reports, including articles from employees of your center in the German media, or German-speaking media. That's helpful. But there's only a few publications in Germany that are willing to document this type of anti-Semitism and how German taxpayers are paying for material that promotes the liquidation of Israel.
Is there no body that would be looking at transparency? Let's put the anti-Semitism issue aside. Transparency and accountability. There's no factor that would.
Are there any bodies that would in Germany that would be looking at transparency and accountability in terms of this type of financial misconduct and governmental, I would argue, misappropriation of funds? Yes, there are organizations in Germany. There's a very well-known Transparency Institute that that examines money laundering and financial misconduct and illicit terror finance. Fortunately, they haven't focused on Germany. They tend to focus on countries outside of Germany, and within Germany, Germany's been accused of allowing financial misconduct, and there's a lot of there's not much transparency in terms of the banking system. financial transfers. I've reported on this over the years where a German bank sent a significant amount of money to Hamas, the terrorist movement that runs the Gaza Strip. And this German bank allegedly accidentally made a very large transfer of money to Hamas a number of years. I was trying to find out the name of the German bank. I couldn't find out. And as far as I know, the German bank faced no penalties, although it financed terrorism. So my point is that Germany has a systemic problem, I would argue, where there's very little transparency about its financial streams, its bank sector, its companies that are active. And we see that not only in terms of UNRWA and the Palestinians, but also in terms of German-Iranian business relations, where Germany has remained for years the most important European Union business partner for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and German technology and equipment keeps the Islamic Republic of Iran afloat, especially all the mid-level engineering companies that are involved in Iran. And Germany has sold, as I've reported 2 years ago, sold technology to Iranian companies that later turned up in missiles in Syria, chemical missiles that were used to gas Syrians.
Is there knowledge in Germany? Is there consciousness of what's going on in this? I hear that there's very little reporting. Is there any consciousness of what we're talking about?
Is there any consciousness about the financial misconduct involved in UNRWA or
in PFL? I mean, this also leads to the other question, which is, why is Hamas and the PFLP not even listed as terrorist organizations with Germany?
Why are Hamas and the PFLP not listed as terrorist organizations? The Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization. To my knowledge, the PFLP is not. Both organizations are listed by the European Union as terrorist organizations. Germany, and this is where it's the hypocrisy is striking, because Germany again hides behind the EU skirt, as I mentioned, and adopts all the EU resolutions and will not make a decision without consulting the EU, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to jihadi organizations, especially organizations that have had a very strong presence in Germany, namely the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, Germany somehow doesn't list this organization on its terrorism list. In fact, I documented this a number of years ago where the PFLP and people who were supporting the PFLP were on a list to a voter list as part of the Marxist-Leninist Party of Germany. There is such a party in Germany, and the people who sympathize with the PFLP and were affiliated with the PFLP in a certain way made it onto this list, and they campaigned to enter the European Parliament. Germany took no action against this list. I reported on it. The Marxist-Leninist Party of Germany filed a lawsuit against me and my articles. It didn't go anywhere, but it exposed them, and it caused the bank account. At that time, it was the Deutsche Bank and the Postbank to close their accounts. So after exposing these connections, these terrorism connections between this German extremist leftist party and the PFLP, I sent the material to the bank, asked them, are you financing terrorism? And they closed the accounts, and the Marxist party sued the bank and lost that case as well. So the banks were nervous, obviously, because they've been penalized by the United States government, Deutsche Bank, for huge sums of money because of their circumvention and busting of U.S. sanctions targeting, at that time, Iran, Sudan, and Cuba. So the German political class is largely, as I've mentioned, indifferent. Civil society is largely uninformed because the media spends most of its time turning Israel into a human punching bag instead of exposing terrorist movements in the Middle East. Why is the German media, and also I would argue German politicians, many, not all, many, involved in turning Israel into a human punching bag? Well, it's now politically and socially correct, or well, I should have mentioned, excuse me, it's politically and socially incorrect to, for the most part, to turn Jews, especially in Europe, into human punching bags. But because as we know, anti-Semitism has experienced a metamorphosis, and now, as many famous historians have argued, Israel is now has become the collective Jew among nations. So that phrase, I think, really sums up what's happening here. Is you can turn Israel into a human punching bag, and in your own sort of anti-Semitic cognitions, this allows you to do indirectly what you can't do directly, namely impose discipline and punishment on Jews. Now, in Germany, I would argue there's a different form of anti-Semitism at work that's not as ubiquitous as with respect to the rest of Europe, and it's non-existent in the U.S. and I would argue Great Britain, and that is what I call, or what two famous German Jewish scholars, philosophers, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, used the phrase in the 40s, guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. So you have Germans who, and many German journalists, who are filled with a sense of pathological guilt, and I'll break down this fancy term, guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. And that means that you have a feeling where you're filled with pathological guilt about the crimes of the National Socialists and the Holocaust. So in response to the Holocaust, in response to the Shoah, many Germans, I would argue a majority, are filled with a sense of pathological guilt about the crimes of the Holocaust, their family's complicity in the Holocaust, or simply their reaction to the Shoah. And as a way to purge or cleanse the guilt in their character structure, they beat up on Israel. So that's why you see in the German media a disproportionate amount of articles attacking Israel. A number of years ago, it's not as prevalent. You would see a very high level of number of articles equating Israel with Nazi Germany. You'd see articles, still very prevalent, equating Israel with the former racist system in apartheid, South Africa. You would see, just a striking level of a lack of empathy about terror attacks targeting Jews, because, again, as a result of this type of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, many Germans feel, well, the Jews deserve this, or the Israelis, Jews, I'm using the word in the same way, have inflicted so much suffering, putting that in scary quotes, on the Palestinians, that this equalizes it out. All sorts of ethical corruption associated with an analysis of Israel that comes from the German media. The best line that sums up this type of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, was captured by an Israeli psychoanalyst. It's become a very famous quote, at least among the intelligentsia. And Zivi Rex said in the mid to late 1980s, in the 80s, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. The Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. I want to repeat that because that form of anti-Semitism, based on my nearly 20 years of reporting on Germany and over 15 years of living in Germany, perfectly captures my experience. But I would argue now what we're experiencing in Germany and Austria and Western Europe is another layer to this type of anti-Semitism, and that is, namely, the Western Europeans, especially the Germans and the Austrians, will never forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. And that's why you see Germany, and mainly Germany, actually Austria has become a bit better under a more enlightened chancellor, Sebastian Kurz. Germany has still tangled up in this form of anti-Semitism in response to the Holocaust.
Has there been any legal action taken against Germans who are involved with terror groups?
Has there been any legal action taken against Germans who have been involved in terrorist groups? There have been prosecutions and convictions of some Germans who have been involved in, well, I should say a German Pakistani, believe he had German citizenship at the time, a number of years ago, who plotted to, according to one German media report, assassinate pro-Israeli advocates and possibly a French Israeli professor. He was convicted, and he was basically a contract killer for the Islamic Republic of Iran and their Al-Quds force. He lived near in Bremen in northern Germany, and he was convicted. What was Germany's reaction to the Iranian regime's use of him as an assassin? They simply rebuked the diplomat. They didn't expel anyone. They didn't recall their ambassador. So it was a laughable penalty on a diplomatic level when you have an Iranian regime-sponsored assassin who's surveilling Jewish institutions and plotting an assassination of a pro-Israel advocate and possibly a French Israeli professor. There have been other cases involving closures, or I should say seizures, of groups that are affiliated with Sunni jihadi organizations. There have been cases of, well, there was the notable case last year of Germany, thanks to Ambassador Richard Grenell, then Ambassador Richard Grenell, U.S. Ambassador to Germany, who pushed the Germans and brought about their banning of Hezbollah activities. But the Germans tend to ignore, for example, and I've pointed this out in the Wall Street Journal and other publications, tend to ignore Holocaust denial when it comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran on German soil. I've documented 2 cases from the Larijani brothers in Iran. One was the former head of the parliament, Mohammed, and his brother, Ali Larijani was the head of the parliament. His brother Mohammed was the head of some type of human rights body in Iran, whatever that means. And both of them at different times denied the Holocaust in Germany. Holocaust denial in Germany is a criminal offense. The German government declined to prosecute them. But if a neo-Nazi in some East German state denies the Holocaust, he will be prosecuted. Or, for example, if there was a Catholic, extreme Catholic official, priest or bishop, I can't remember his exact title a number of years ago, who also engaged in Holocaust denial, he was prosecuted. So it's very selective, and the German government won't pick fights with the most powerful and lethal enemies of the Jewish people in Israel. So it's selective. In terms of the PFLP, there have been no prosecutions to my knowledge, although there are PFLP supporters in Germany who appear to be involved in fundraising, because I've identified their bank accounts and their organizations and their work with the PFLP over the years. There's not even, to my knowledge, elementary investigations into support of terrorism in Germany. I mean, one has to remember, and I think this neatly captures how indifferent Germany is to jihadi terrorism, that after 9/11, and it's worth remembering, the 9/11 attacks were largely codified in Hamburg with different jihadis who used the latitude of the Hamburg, the city in northern Germany, the latitude of the legal environment in Hamburg to plot their destruction of the towers in New York and the Pentagon and possibly the White House. Now, the 9/11 mosque in Hamburg, where all of this plotting took place, took the Germans 10 years to shut it down.
Why? If it was so obvious, do they not have the ability to read Arabic?
Well, they do have the ability to read Arabic. I mean, I suspect that's a whole nother do the Germans have the ability to read Arabic, and why didn't they close the 9/11 mosque straight away? And why did they wait 10 years after the mass murder of nearly 3,000 Americans to close the mosque that served as the sort of the headquarters for the 9/11 attackers in Hamburg, Germany? And they claim, the Germans claim, well, we're surveilling the mosque, the 9/11 mosque. But at the same time they were surveilling the mosque, a second 9/11 cell formed, and a new jihadi group went to Pakistan and Afghanistan to launch a European-wide attack that is targeting different economic institutions in Germany several years later. So eventually, because of this failure in their intelligence and their whole, the German idea to, well, surveil the mosque in order to secure more intelligence, that turned out to be a huge flop, and they were forced to shut down the mosque. The Americans, of course, were the ones who secured the intelligence about the second 9/11 plot, not the Germans, and prevented this second 9/11 attack, this time in Europe. Now, the resistance, I think, to cracking down on jihadi structures in Germany, whether it's Hezbollah, the PFLP, Hamas, because there are Hamas members in Germany according to their intelligence reports, I suspect is also based on this German idea, well, we don't want to pick fights because there'll be a backlash and we'll face new terrorism attacks. Now, of course, there have been terrorism attacks, even though the Germans employ this form of appeasement toward these groups. And I also think there's this notion of Germany wanting to be Miss Congeniality. We want to be liked by everybody, including Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations and regimes like Iran. We don't want to pick fights with these groups, but they do pick fights with Israel. I mean, I guess the irony of all this is Germany claims it has a special relationship with Israel, but the special relationship has turned out to be terribly non-special because Germany ends up criticizing the Americans and Israel most of the time, while not criticizing the true enemies of the free world, namely Iran's regime and Qatar and other countries.
To what extent do the German people, German education, deal with the early stages of Nazism and what happened?
To what extent do the Germans deal with the stages of Nazism in the
early stages, and to what extent is that understood in relationship to what happens today?
To what extent do the Germans teach Nazism in connection with what's happening today? My sense is it's not being taught. There's no curriculum about the interplay between, for example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement targeting Israel right now, this anti-Semitic movement that was formed in 2005, and the Hitler movement's economic boycott of Jewish businesses in 1930. Strikes me, if you want to learn about the contemporary anti-Semitism and classical anti-Semitism, compare the two, because there's striking similarities. None of that's being taught. And of course, it's there's scarce objective material about Israel in the curriculum, or even on college campuses. Israel is presented as, in most cases, at least by many of the academics teaching in Israel, as a highly jingoistic state, and all sorts of, by a number of these professors, all sorts of anti-Semitic cliches are employed. As I've mentioned, I've reported on this for years. I remember one professor in Lower Saxony, in Göttingen, I believe it was, university in Lower Saxony, in the state of Lower Saxony, who a number of years ago claimed that the Israeli athletes at the 72 Munich Games, who were killed by the Palestinian terrorist group Black September, actually wanted to commit collective suicide, like, because of the history of Judaism and the notion of Jews who have engaged in suicide in history to avoid being murdered, for example, by the Romans. The classic case that this was an expression he was arguing in a paper of not being somehow the fault of Black September, but being the fault of Israelis. Again, a classical case of blaming the Jews even for a terrorist attack, but even in the most esoteric, absurd terms that only an intellectual, as George Orwell famously said, could formulate.
What you've painted today is a very black picture. Is there anyone in Germany who you could identify as someone up and coming who wants to challenge this, the atmosphere of what's going on?
Is there anyone in Germany who would be willing to challenge this anti-Israeli atmosphere, or
is there an emerging voice?
Is there an emerging voice in Germany who's willing to challenge this sort of dark atmosphere in Germany? I think the trend right now is rather bleak. I'll answer your question because I don't want to sound completely, or I don't want to make everyone clinically depressed, because there are strands of optimism. But I should note, even groups, for example, like the Young Socialist Organization, which is the youth organization of the Social Democratic Party, a coalition partner of Merkel. This is a youth organization, and these youth parties that are affiliated with German political parties are very important because they groom the next candidate to be chancellor or vice chancellor or foreign minister, and it's an organization for Germans under 35. They recently, last year, joined the Fatah youth organization, and the Young Socialists from Heiko Maas's party, the foreign minister, declared their solidarity with the Fatah youth organization that promotes BDS and promotes all the stuff that you've uncovered in your work about deleting Israel from the map, the map in the UNRWA school books, etc. All that type of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic material, in the UNRWA school books. This is all endorsed by the Young Fatah party that just is aligned with the Young Socialist. I had thought that the Young Socialists over the years, and I've reported on them, showed more enlightened views because they've opposed BDS, some of their chapters, but at their convention, they align themselves with a deeply anti-Semitic Palestinian organization. That's the young group of Germany. Now, there are some organizations, and they're very small. I mean, there's the Stop the Bomb campaign in Germany and Austria that seeks to promote more of a action-oriented approach to changing German attitudes by staging protests in front of companies or hotels that work with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and or politicians that have worked with Iran at different events. And this group works with Iranian dissidents and other young Germans, mainly, and other Germans. There's a Middle East Freedom Forum in Berlin, which hosts Israeli speakers and other academics and politicians who are more enlightened about Israel and understand what contemporary anti-Semitism is. Now, there's no similar system to the United States like AIPAC, or Australia has its own version of sort of AIPAC. That's what's largely needed, but the Germans would obviously have to graft onto this organization their own features, because you can't impose AIPAC on Germany. It would have to be a bottom-up style organization that's crafted to meet the internal relations of German politics. That's possible because there is a certain percentage of the German population that is pro-Israel. There are many, there are a fair number of Christian Zionists in Germany who support Israel, but it's largely unorganized. There is the German-Israeli Friendship Society, and this is a government-sponsored group that has different chapters across Germany, but it's government-funded. So it largely mirrors the policies of Germany. Now, there is someone who runs it now who's very, very pro-Israel, Uwe Becker, who's the deputy mayor of Frankfurt, and he takes positions that are contrary to the German government as the new leader of the German-Israeli Friendship Society. But what you need, and I've stressed this over the years, is you need a mass organization that's comparable to how AIPAC started in the United States. AIPAC, of course, is a pro-Israel organization that works to strengthen American-Israeli security. And you need a German organization that works to, independent of the German government's views, to strengthen the German-Israeli partnership, but also advance the security interests of the Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, that organization would need to do a lot of grassroots organizing, similar to what AIPAC did in the 50s, and build chapters in each of the German states, in the 16 states. And it should not be just centered on the college campuses. It should be centered in civil society organizations. That work would require, in my view, within 15, 20 years, you could have a full-blown, high-intensity organization that could change Germany's political positions within the government, but also German attitudes. Within a shorter period of time, I would say under 10 years, you could begin to make some serious progress. But that would require, as I said, heavy investments from private donors in Germany who believe in, whatever their motivation is, whether it's responsibility for the Holocaust, whether it's simply democracy promotion in the Middle East, whether it's strengthening the Jewish community, the largest Jewish community in the world, namely in Israel. The motivation is a separate question. But there needs to be infrastructure, and that, as I said, Germany is a bundle of potential in that with that respect, but it's right now it's unorganized and non-mobilized. And I would also argue Israel, you can see this in many respects, is focused on the East. I think there's a feeling among many Israelis and government officials that, and pro-Israel supporters, that Western Europe is not as important as a stage, even though it is, because as you've pointed out through your work in UNRWA, especially with respect to Germany, the Germans are funding the major sponsor of UNRWA and other UN bodies, and Germany is a key player in terms of right now in damaging Israel's interests.
Does Germany understand, does anyone in Germany understand that their support of UNRWA perpetuates the suffering of Arabs, keeping them in refugee camps for another generation?
Does anyone in Germany understand that by supporting UNRWA, it's perpetuating the conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and keeping Palestinians in these refugee camps for another generation? Few journalists, policymakers, some may have internalized it, but for reasons they don't want to articulate, go with the party line, namely we have to stay wedded to UNRWA. So it's not in any way, shape, or form this enormous problem of perpetuating the conflict by the perpetual funding of UNRWA in front and center in the thinking of the German population or the political class.
The UNRWA is promoting the concept of not of what they call two-state solution, but a one-state solution where Arabs get everything they lost in '48. And the prime funder is now Germany. Does anyone understand that?
Does anyone understand that UNRWA is promoting the idea of a one-state solution that goes back to 1948, where Israel would be essentially abolished and the Arabs would get everything they wanted. Do folks in Germany understand that? No. Again, there's a very impoverished understanding of basic Middle East history within Germany. And as I've said, this notion of guilt offensiveness, anti-Semitism is so ubiquitous in Germany. It's extraordinarily high levels of anti-Semitism in Germany, especially toward Israel, the attitudes, that it clouds or distorts the thinking of Germans about these other issues, including their taxpayer money being used to fund anti-Semitism and counter peace proposals. Now, again, I don't, to change these attitudes on a significant level where there can be public policy changes or where you can move the policy dial, because that's the business that you folks are in, and you want changes, and so does the Israeli government, I would imagine, and the previous American government did defund UNRWA, which was a really solid step. In order to bring that about, you would need, as I've mentioned, a mass organization in Germany, and that requires a whole new level of commitment. Working on the level of the media is good. It helps educate. It changes some attitudes. Working on the level of holding events is also good, but most times many of these organizations end up preaching to the choir in Germany. So you have to find a way to reach the undecideds or the moderates in Germany who have never really thought about this. But once you explain to them in a very in a highly intensive way, where you have a real conversation face to face, you can change attitudes. But again, that requires, as I've stressed over and over, because all the other models I've seen over the last 20 years have failed in Germany. That means you need to engage in a high-intensity organizational campaign where you begin to win over significant swaths of the German population, and then the base, that means the civil society, can then vote politicians into office who will not vote to spend their money to promote anti-Semitic UNRWA material. We saw that with the previous U.S. government and its stoppage of UNRWA. I think that helped enormously to bring the whole matter of UNRWA's pro-terrorism policies and pro-anti-Semitic policies to the fore. That's obviously to your credit, because you've been doing this for decades, and I think when Trump or the U.S. government at that time pulled the plug on UNRWA funding, you certainly, your organization, the David Benden Center here in Jerusalem, I think played a very significant role in, after years, to help bring that to the fore, and why the funding is no longer, funding UNRWA is no longer useful. So there is a precedent out there which is important, that the U.S. government at least one time pulled the plug on UNRWA. And I think you can use that obviously to educate people about why this organization, UNRWA, is fundamentally corrupt, and there needs to be a whole new system. One other way you could also maybe educate Germans, I've seen some of this material, is when the Allies defeated the Hitler movement, Germans in what was then a current part of Poland and Czechoslovakia were forcibly removed and re-entered the post-World War II Germany. So they were living in parts of Poland and on the border of Germany, and living in a part of Czechoslovakia, or then Czechoslovakia, and these people who were German-speaking citizens of the Nazi Germany were forced to leave their homes, and those countries that became part of the Eastern Bloc, that's now defunct, took over that territory. They have no right of return, the Germans. They have no right to financial compensation. And that's a recent wave of, in the late 40s, mid-late 40s of Germans, and their descendants have no claims on that property or that territory. Now, if you can explain that to the Germans, that we're in a situation with the Palestinians that's completely comparable. Actually, it's far worse, because now we're dealing with, third, fourth, fifth generation. I mean, it's their descendants. Excuse me. It shows you, how absurd the system is, and this is only targeting Israel. It's not targeting any other territorial dispute. I think some Germans, or I would argue many Germans, would understand that. And that might sort of ring some bells and make them more conscious of the dispute. But obviously, what you folks are doing, I know Talia Goldstein just wrote a piece for a Swiss website in German about German taxpayer money and the misuse of it for UNRWA. That's a very solid argument. I think you can also win over some people and German politicians by highlighting that your taxpayer dollars are funding a fundamentally corrupt organization that sponsors terrorism and anti-Semitism. What do you plan to do about it?
Any role that the church can play in this?
Church complain about any of the UNRWA?
Can they play any role?
No, the church, both the Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany have not delved into this issue. Both churches issue the boilerplate statements about being opposed to anti-Semitism, but the Protestant church has been deeply unsettling because they allow some of their affiliates, educational centers, for example, one in Baden-Württemberg, I believe, to work with BDS activists and hold conferences in support of delegitimizing Israel. And of course, the upper layers, the top layers of the Protestant church, attempt to chalk it up to free speech. So it's a sense of, I would argue that both the German Catholic and Protestant churches have not learned the lessons of the Holocaust. There's a Catholic organization, a radical left-wing Catholic organization that also promotes BDS in Germany and uses the Catholic bank system to raise funds. And the Catholic Church in Germany has not cracked down on this pro-BDS organization in Germany.
I want to thank you very much. I learned a lot here. Thank you.